Dracus's vision tunneled. The edges of the interrogation cell blurred and darkened into a useless thermal haze, and the only thing remaining in sharp focus was the Terran sitting opposite him. The young officer's biology was screaming that everything else in the universe was irrelevant. The sound echoing off the reinforced bulkheads wasn't a weapon. It was just vibrating strings over a hollow wooden cavity, which made absolutely no tactical sense. Yet Dracus's heat pits were blinding themselves in a desperate attempt to process the mathematical perfection of the frequency. The human's fingers danced across the neck of the wooden box. Dracus couldn't breathe. Would you have stopped the interrogation right then, or would you have let the sound keep tearing your reality apart? Because the young officer let him play. The synthetic leather of the scout ship's pilot seat still held the bizarre, compressed contours of the alien's physiology. 4 hours before the captive started playing that wooden box, Dracus remembered thinking that whatever could survive sitting in that twisted configuration must possess a skeletal structure built entirely out of spite. He had spent 20 standard minutes just staring at that chair. It was adjusted for a body shape no known species recognized, lacking proper lumbar support plates or tail grooves. It looked agonizing. As a provisional sub-commander on his very first solo assignment, Dracus was supposed to be cataloging threat vectors. He was supposed to be proving he deserved the rank insignia currently chafing his collar scales. Instead, he found himself captivated by the adaptability of a creature that could fold itself into such a miserable piece of engineering. The human hadn't fought back when the boarding party breached his hull. He had simply dropped to the deck and curled his entirely unprotected body around a battered wooden case, shielding it as if it held the thermal core of his homeworld. It was a completely irrational tactical decision that contradicted every survival protocol programmed into the Dracon datapad. Now, he sat. The cell was heavily pressurized and heated to standard metabolic requirements. Most mammalian captives were weeping from dehydration within the first 10 minutes. Their capillary networks usually ruptured under the atmospheric stress. The Terran just rolled up the fabric covering his upper limbs and leaned back against the Durastel restraint chair. He looked completely unbothered. He didn't even pant. Dracus initiated the primary scan matrix. The ominous hum of the neuro-interrogator filled the stifling air, vibrating the deck plates beneath their claws. "Are you comfortable?" Dracus asked. The human glanced at the ceiling grid, where the sensory probes were extending. "Your torture devices look like our antique kitchen appliances." Dracus was prepared to demand planetary coordinates when a red light flashed on the console. Just a minor atmospheric recalibration. He engaged the secondary thermal lamps. "You surrendered without engaging your weapon systems," Dracus said. "You protected only a biological storage container. Why?" The captive looked at the wooden case resting on the metal table between them. "It's not a container. It's a guitar." The translator matrix choked on the word. The human was unarmed. Well, he possessed solid calcium ridges in his mouth, but at the time that didn't seem mathematically relevant. "I need to hold it," the human said. "To explain. If the High Command reviewed this recording and saw a provisional officer handing a captive an unidentified object, Dracus would be demoted to plasma scrubber before the cycle ended, which meant his family's access to the central incubation vaults would be permanently revoked, plunging his lineage into the lower thermal tiers for the next 3 generations, just because he felt a sudden, inexplicable compulsion to see what the Terran was holding. He handed it to the human anyway. Dracus still didn't know why. The Terran pulled the polished instrument from its velvet lining. He adjusted a row of metal pegs at the top. The air recycler above them rattled on its worn bearings. Dracus caught himself thinking that the maintenance crew had promised to replace that fan belt 3 rotations ago. Then the human pressed his fingers to the wire strings. He struck them. A single chord filled the room. The sound hit Dracus's auditory canals and instantly scrambled his central nervous system. His tail coiled defensively beneath his chair, the heavy scales locking together in a rigid, involuntary spasm of biological rejection. The acoustic waves were literally altering the ambient temperature of the room in micro-fluctuations. Drakes watched the Terran's biological rhythms stabilize perfectly. The human wasn't fighting the punishing heat of the interrogation cell. He was orchestrating it. Every vibration from the heavy wire strings sent a cascading ripple through the localized air density, a physical pressure that Drakes' hypersensitive heat pits interpreted as miniature, rhythmic thermal blooms flashing across his snout. It was an extraordinary manipulation of basic physics. The universe was suddenly vastly larger and vastly more dangerous than the young officer had ever been taught in the Central Incubation Academies. Drakes reached for the security relay to order a full tactical lockdown of the melody shifted. It dropped into a slower, heavier cadence. His claws involuntarily retracted from the panic button. He found himself simply sitting there, entirely paralyzed by the math. The sheer, terrifying audacity of a species that traveled through the lethal, unforgiving vacuum of space-carrying fragile wooden instruments was staggering. They didn't bring plasma casters to a first contact event. They brought an acoustic atmosphere manipulator, and they surrendered on purpose. The captive's eyes were closed, his entire posture conveying a predatory relaxation that completely contradicted his status as a prisoner aboard a warship, which was a behavioral anomaly that Drakes knew he should be logging into the official threat assessment matrix, but found himself entirely unable to process. The human's fingers danced across the neck of the wooden box, exactly as they had when Drakes' vision had first collapsed into that terrifying thermal static. The young officer finally dragged a breath of scorching air into his lungs. He forced his primary eyes to track the glowing tactical display on the desk, which still projected the Terran baseline species file. The data scrolled relentlessly. They were a civilization fully capable of constructing theoretical Dyson swarms to capture an entire stellar output, 3.8 times 10 to the 26th watts of raw, unfiltered energy. It was enough mathematical power to fuel any planetary annihilation system imaginable. What Drakes witnessed in this cell was not a lack of predatory capability. They held the math to burn the galaxy, and they chose to carve this hollow wooden box instead. The small smudge of engine grease on the corner of the interrogation console caught Drakes' attention. He focused on that dark smear for a long time, trying to keep his hands from shaking. The final harmonic vibration faded into the reinforced bulkheads. Drakes looked past the Terran, his gaze locking onto the scout ship's pilot seat sitting in the adjacent evidence bay. He had thought its bizarre compressed shape was a primitive design flaw. It wasn't. It was undeniable proof that a human would willingly adapt to absolutely any contortion, any agonizing physical constraint, just to slip into an empire's heart and wait. The captive rested a calloused palm flat against the wire strings. "Peace isn't the absence of war," the human said quietly. "Peace is what happens when we decide you've learned."